Due to copyright, I can't publish many audiobooks on YouTube. At our audiobook novel service, we offer access to over 300 full novels from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, Wuxia, and more, all in high-quality audio format. Each novel is available with a one-time payment only. No subscriptions, no monthly payment, and no ads. Payments via PayPal or Ko-fi. To browse the full list of available novels, message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out our full catalog on Discord. Chapter 241. Let's Play. Northern passed the two of them and waited in front. Helena and Raven slowly turned, silently observing. Terence was further back, her face plastered with divine awe. She had been looking at Northern that way ever since he cloned himself. The other two clones walked and stopped behind Northern. Another shudder took the entire forest by storm, being the most violent one so far. And finally, the creature, emerging from the embrace of darkness, revealed its true form. Northern. And the others' heads slowly slid up as the abomination manifested before them. A nightmarish amalgamation writhing with countless grotesque tentacles and appendages. At its core lurked a vaguely humanoid shape, elongated claws extending from distorted limbs made of shifting, mottled grays and blacks. Sickly white bony protrusions jutted outward, giving the illusion of countless eyes, each one insanely observing the expanse before it. A gaping maw filled with jagged fangs, surrounded by oscillating smaller mouths, composed its main head, radiating an aura of primal chaos, one Northern wasn't accustomed to. Northern looked up beyond the monster's immense, ever-morphing bulk, and saw that the twin moons had vanished, blotted out by this eldritch abomination. He clicked his tongue irritably and muttered, loud enough for the others to hear, "We've been abducted." Helena frowned, her gaze lifting toward the now empty sky. This must be it, where it brings people to devour them. Raven's head moved almost imperceptibly as she took in the colossal, sanity-devouring presence before them. An amalgamation of pure horror made manifest, its magnitude dwarfing them utterly. Then she looked below it. Its entire form was buried in a flower-shaped pericarp with tentacle-like vines, deeply rooted into the ground. And from the base of its form came slowly trudging humans holding weapons of various kinds, all darkened by a vicious and maddening shroud of darkness, their minds forever enslaved by the abomination that loomed before them. As Helena watched the thralls trudge toward them, she radiated with even more anger. She could see people that she recognized, people she talked to, fought with, all of them, acting rabid and vicious, lost to the mental tethers of this monster. She bit her lips bitterly and called to Northern. "Hey!" She breathed before continuing, her voice radiating with vengeance. "I'll be leaving that damned monster to you. Kill it in the most dreadful and painful way possible." Northern looked back with a blank expression at first. Then he grinned viciously. "Leave it to me." Helena also grinned, wearing that feral sage look back on her vibrant face. "Then leave these minions to us." A crimson lightning reflected in their eyes, and Northern was gone. None of the three saw him move. Just in an instant, a red lance, formed by a coalescence of hundreds of lightning rods condensed into a single stroke, appeared from the empty sky and struck down upon the horror like mighty thunder. The crimson lance detonated against the abomination with the force of a small apocalypse, unleashing a shockwave that flattened the surrounding forest in an instant. The ensuing thunderclap was deafening, like the earth itself was being rent asunder. The thralls lost their balance, clumsily falling, many of them thrown away by the force of the shockwave. While this affected the cohort too, they stood resolute, worthy of their reputation as one of the strongest groups of drifters around. Helena couldn't wipe the look of surprise away from her face as she hung her eyes above. This guy, Northern, far exceeded whatever her expectations were. "And he's a drifter?" she scoffed. "Something must be amiss here." The thralls barely had time to recover from Northern's earth-shattering opening salvo before Raven was amongst them in a whirlwind of flashing steel. Her swords were blurred arcs of annihilation, each strike delivering pinpoint trauma to sever arteries, tendons, and nerves with surgical precision. She moved with the ceaseless tempo of a raging thunderstorm, every motion blending seamlessly into the next as her blades wove an impenetrable sphere of destruction around her. Here, a cross-slash opened a thrall from shoulder to opposite hip, spraying rancid vitae in a pulsing arc. There, a pinpoint thrust found the soft hollows beneath the jawline before whipping out the other side in an explosion of ruined flesh. All the while, her footwork was sublime, dizzying pivots, deft slides, elegant spins, Raven herself the eye of a scattered tornado of shredded limbs and plumes of viscera. She struck and moved, the thralls falling like scythed wheat before her whirling dervish of lethality. Despite the cataclysmic impact, the horror remained seemingly unperturbed, its grotesque, ever-shifting form weathering the onslaught as easily as a rock shrugs off the sea. If anything, it seemed to almost absorb the destructive energies radiating from the strike, pulsating in a way that hinted at dark amusement. To Northern's stunned eyes, the creature had no discernible weaknesses, no clear targets to aim his devastating attacks. It was an amorphous, constantly regenerating mass of primal chaos and malice given hideous form. Each severed tentacle or sheared appendage was instantly replaced, the ruin flowing seamlessly back into that surging, undulating bulk. How did one even begin to fight such an entity? A rod of burning crimson flames appeared in his grip. He tightened his hands around it and glared at the monster. It's quite unfortunate. I can't use my eyes in this form. Since he was equipping Khal's soul, Northern was in a state vastly different from himself. He was practically Khal in all form and essence, relinquishing all physical and active abilities of himself, including all that all eyes had to offer. He missed it, but observing the world from Khal's perception wasn't distasteful either. If anything, it was smooth. Everything played out before his eyes in such a way that he was able to discern the optimum time and form of action, hence allowing him to move at the best speed or launch the best attacks. It was a raw and profound feeling, one that he could get addicted to. But it was not going to be enough. He needed all eyes. TCH. Northern clicked his tongue frustratingly. He didn't want to give in so quickly. He wanted to push himself further. This was finally a chance to showcase his strength, both to himself and to the onlookers. He didn't know why, but with all he had gathered so far, he just really wanted to have some fun. Fine. He accepted. Let's play. Chapter 242. A Cataclysmal Playground Part 1. When the first questing appendage lashed out, a slithering tendril of corded muscle tipped with a claw-fringed maw, Northern was already moving. He flowed around the probing attack with liquid grace, the crimson lance a cunning feint in his hands. As the appendage surged past where he'd been standing, overextended by the momentum of its lunge, Northern struck. The crimson lance of flames slammed into the offending limb just above its gnashing tip, instantly cauterizing the flesh in an explosion of red, withering energy. A shockwave detonated outwards with enough concussive force to splinter nearby tree trunks. The severed, smoking length of tentacle ragdolled away, crashing through the tortured earth until it finally lay twitching in rapidly dissolving ruin. But it was just another opening salvo. No sooner had that first limb been neutralized than two more surged forth from the horror's pulsing form, a pair of whip-like tendrils that lashed towards Northern from opposite angles, their tips dripping with some foul ichor that sizzled when it struck the ground. Releasing a strained groaning, Northern rabbit low and then exploded upwards in a soaring leap, twisting his body into a corkscrew flip that carried him through the narrowest of openings between the snapping attacks. As he reached the apex of his gravity-defying arc, he lashed out with another lance in mid-revolution. Twin detonations of force ripped through the air, atomizing the questing tendrils in rapid succession. Northern landed in a semi-crouch, momentum carrying him into a shoulder roll that flowed seamlessly back to his feet, already moving to engage the abomination's next strike. On and on the exchange raged, a lethal dance where even the slightest misstep, the barest hesitation carried a cost too horrific to comprehend. Time seemed to simultaneously slow to a crawl and accelerate wildly as Northern matched the horror's onslaught, countering each nightmarish attack with increasingly savage reprisals of Call's own with his clones on standby for when they will be needed. Yet no matter how much of its mass he severed, rend and detonated, more kept surging forth to take its place. A kaleidoscopic array of gnashing jaws, slashing talons, whip-like tendrils, and any other manner of grotesque permutations assailed him in a remorseless, ceaseless torrent of violence. Despite the sheer scope of the entity's virulent biomass, despite the overwhelming aura of wrongness it radiated, Northern showed no hint of fear or trepidation. If anything, his expression was one of faint excitement and a detached analysis as he sized up this latest challenge. As the horror seemed to sense a susurrant reverberation akin to glass eroding slithered through that amalgamated form, tunneling mouths gnashing in what could have been anticipation or amusement. This foe's power resonated on a different stratum, one that strayed perilously close to the ineffable cosmic boundaries it straddled. No matter, insignificant sparks would be extinguished just like all the others. Defiance was an illusion mortality clung to before the embrace of oblivion. It would break this one as it had countless people before him. With a sound like a black hole's event horizon rupturing, tendrils thicker than redwoods lashed out in an obscene cadence. They twisted into jagged lances, hooks, blades, any manner of punishing configuration capable of skewering, shredding, impaling this insignificant speck that dared raise itself against the sublime. But Northern was already a flash, a blurring red contrail in his wake as he flowed around the first containment attack with seamless ease. In the same motion, his palm sliced out, fingers splayed as if in benediction. Crimson lightning danced between his fingertips, rapidly concentrating into a searing sphere of annihilating force. With a subtle flick of his wrist, the compact singularity of energy essence detonated outwards, unleashing a roaring tsunami of power that crashed against the horror's probing tendrils. They disintegrated instantly under the overwhelming onslaught, cauterized to the very last atom in a blinding haze of thermonuclear energies. The shockwave ripped outwards, scouring the surrounding landscape into a broad impact crater littered with debris and upended trees. But Northern didn't pause, twisting into a whirling dervish as he redirected that torrent of destruction in a spiraling helix. This time, when the lightning-wreathed turbulence detonated, it unleashed countless razor-thin lances of crimson plasma that streaked outwards in an omnidirectional barrage. Everywhere they struck, the abomination's questing tendrils were severed, blown apart, sheared through with the relativistic fury of a dozen atmospheric re-entries compressed into single pinpoint impacts. The forest around them rapidly transformed into an apocalyptic kill zone as that storm of annihilation systematically neutralized any semblance of biomatter daring to exist within its boundaries. At the vortex's luminescent core, Northern hung suspended for a moment, his body wreathed in a burning aurora of power as his gaze met the horror's billion-fold regard. There was no anger there, no triumph or taunt. Only the barest hint of exertion reflected the level of force he had unleashed. Using Call's ability seemed inherent, something he just knew how to do. Perhaps that was because his soul was in a perfect synergy with Northern's entirety. It was because he had such a massive grasp on Call's powers that he also knew that the Maelstrom had definitely not given its all in their last confrontation. Maybe all Call was doing was playing around and then he got ambushed by Night Terror and Northern's attacks. Northern fully realized in this moment that they never got to see the Maelstrom's full power unleashed. And that was a good thing because he could see the rate at which he desecrated the horror's limbs. He wouldn't survive being at the other end of his attacks. He knew that much. Northern sighed, breathing away tiredness. He raised his eyes to the horror, then blinked out of existence once more, a thundering hurricane of energy essence winking out as if it had never been. For a split second, there was only silence and the settling dust of near-total desolation. The next, Northern rematerialized amidst the ruin, barely 10 paces from where the abomination's pulsating, regenerating mass reasserted itself. His palm sliced out once more, this time with all 5 fingertips glowing like newborn sons of blood. Sim Ursa Quinta Tick, he intoned with conversational calm. This time, when those focused beams of power detonated, They lanced forth as muscular javelins of force, 5 brilliant lances of nuclear fury that streaked through the devastated landscape like shooting stars of annihilation. They smashed into the horror's surging form in rapid succession, detonating against that shape-shifting, ever-regenerating mass with the fury of cyclonic firestorms compressed into pinpoint impacts. Eruptions of plasma and scorched, vitric matter geysered outwards with each thunderous detonation. It was as if the entity itself had stumbled into the surface of a newborn sun. Such was the scaled devastation those attacks inflicted. Still, Northern did not let up, unleashing full-power volley after full-power volley as he systematically seared away its burgeoning tendrils and questing limbs with strategic precision strikes.
No wasted motion.
No bravado or grandstanding. Just a focused, relentless series of neutralizing attacks as he countered each of the horror's assaults with remorseless, inevitable force. If it lashed out with whipping cords of musculature, Northern's palms transformed into roaring cannons of plasma that blasted them from existence. Grasping claws and cavernous maws surged forth only to be sundered instantly by those needle-thin lances of energy essence that speared through any defense with surgical accuracy. At one point, the entire bulk of the horror surged forwards as a looming wavefront of mayhem, promising to crush Northern beneath sheer ruthless mass. He simply blinked out of this reality, his deadly form reappearing a scant few meters away as that tsunami of aberrant flesh crashed against the space he'd previously occupied. Without even shifting his expression, Northern re-engaged peripheral crimson beams of power gouging furrows into the heaving, vitric slurry left by the monster's passage. On the battle raged, Northern's indomitable form withering the horror's every attempt at advancement with calculated precision strikes. Craters opened in its wake. The woodland gouged away to reveal only a scorched, vitrified hell's cape more akin to the surface of an airless moon. Yet the entity itself seemed as implacable and fecund as ever, regenerating each sheared-away portion of its mass as swiftly as it was excised. It flowed and reshaped, tested the boundaries of this new threat with mutative strikes and assaults that combined into macro formations of terror. But no matter what malformed, sanity-sundering configurations it birthed from its virulent womb, Northern matched them all with the mathematical precision of a grandmaster playing multidimensional déjà-ric. Attacks that should have been able to scour away entire continents detonated against infinitely adaptable screens of force. Obscenities designed to liquefy the mind and render existence itself asunder found not the slightest purchase against Northern's seemingly impervious psyche. He was the immovable bastion around which this primordial tide broke, unyielding, untouchable, unflappable. Until at long last, after what seemed an eternity of that remorseless exchange of annihilating force, something within the horror's frenzied calculations finally began to prioritize preservation over aggression. Chapter 243. A Cataclysmic Playground Part 2. Helena found herself at a loss for words to express her astonishment. Raven was more than capable of dealing with the thralls, but that didn't mean she wasn't actively engaged. What had happened was that the moment Northern dove into the battle, the entire place shook tremendously. Thus, she couldn't help but look ahead of her. What she saw captured her attention. She stared open-mouthed as Northern unleashed devastating attacks on the colossal horror. With each strike, the earth scattered, trees flew, and the thralls became the least of their concerns. Now, they had to focus more on surviving the cataclysm that erupted from every one of Northern's attacks. And that task required far more energy than dealing with a few mind-enslaved drifters. At some point, Helena had to stop in her tracks and look back, barely resisting the urge to shout and tell Northern to consider their safety too. The guy was practically fighting as if he were the only one present. But that would have been too much to ask. Besides its domineering size, the horror possessed an unfair ultra-healing ability. Northern had probably realized that the only way to win this battle was through heavy attacks first. Due to the monster's enormous body, it was imperative that the damage inflicted must be felt. Second, he had to deal damage faster than the monster could recover. And when one combined those heavy attacks with the rate at which they were dealt per minute, then a result was bound to occur. They just had to trust the white-haired boy. Or was it black-haired now? She didn't even know the case. Helena swiftly shot forward, escaping the shockwave force of Northern's latest attack, meanwhile grabbing Terence in the process. Raven fared well on her own. She gritted her teeth and somehow managed to withstand the powerful force without faltering. I envy her. Helena turned her eyes to Terence, whom she was supporting with one hand. Are you all right, my lady? Helena tenderly provided Terence with more support as she asked. Ah, yes, I am. Terence, on the other hand, seemed a little flustered and confused. She too had her eyes fixated on the ongoing destruction being wrought by Northern. While she had never once thought Northern was weak, what was happening right now far exceeded whatever expectations she had. She was sure that not even Raven would be able to deny the shock and surprise. How could anyone be so powerful as a drifter? Terence lingered a bit, then turned her head slightly toward Helena. Sage Helena. Helena moved a little closer. Yes, my lady? I have a question. Ask away, she retorted light-heartedly. You are a sage. Do you think you can defeat Northern in combat? Helena's eyes widened for a minute. She was dumbfounded. Since when were priestesses interested in combats? She had always envisioned them as gentle, battle-weary vessels of holiness, choosing to talk it out over conflict any time, any day. Regardless, Terence's question caused her to truly consider it. After a while, she then said, It's very unusual for a drifter to hold so much power. If he has heritage, it can be quite understandable. Helena paused. Heritages were something that boosted the power of a drifter, regardless of their rank. To put it simply, it's a vestige of power that a drifter obtains during rift exploration or challenges. There are different vestiges, and their purpose is to bring the drifter closer to the reality of their true name. When a vestige resonates with the drifter's true name, it is automatically absorbed into the drifter's soul and becomes a heritage. Heritage may give the drifter different boosts, such as another attribute, another talent ability, or even a unique weapon related to the essence of their true name. In some cases, combat and spell arts. What Northern stumbled upon back in the rift was indeed a heritage, but quite different in many ways. Helena moved slightly and shrugged. To be honest, I don't see myself losing. There are many factors that contribute to a drifter-to-drifter fight, including combat strategy, terrain advantage. I have an ability that gives me favorability over many natural elements. If I were to take him on, it would be difficult for him to keep up with me, and it would probably be an exhausting fight. But no, I cannot lose. She made this clear and glanced at Northern, who was in the middle of another cataclysmic attack, although they were now quite far from the center and didn't have to worry as much. Helena narrowed her eyes slightly, and a second later, her voice was heard again. But he is strong. I don't think there's any drifter or nomad that can take him on. Terence nodded. You're right. Meanwhile, the intense battle between Northern and the air hung thick with the charnel reek of ionized particles. Red sizzling sparks flew here and there, remnants of Khal's devastating essence. His essence alone was different, having a first-hand feel to it. Northern could accurately discern the difference between it and when he used to have soul essence. If anything, it felt more similar to void essence, but even at that, he couldn't accurately put his finger on it. The best he had used void essence were the flames. He had never used it on such a cataclysmic scale as he had with Khal's soul essence. Northern flexed his hands, closing and opening them. Then he looked forward at the wailing Kirathon. The monster screeched into the dark sky, piercing the air with its deafening cry, such that the wind trembled with visible waves of vibration. Everything froze under intense pressure. Even Northern barely hung on. The monster then slowly turned toward him, its hands extending out of its body and slamming into the ground. The tendrils that made up for other hands shot at Northern at blinding speeds. But he simply waved his palm. In a blink, an array of crimson lances appeared before him and collided with the monster's tendrils, causing a midair detonation against the whitish tendrils. Northern materialized 2 more lances, held them tightly like swords and staggered back as if about to fall. But in the next millisecond, he vanished. Chapter 244. A Cataclysmic Playground Part 3. Northern vanished and reappeared high in the air above the Kirathon's massive form. Twin crimson lances blazed in his hands as he arced downwards, letting out a thunderous battle cry. The lances left streaks of crimson energy as Northern descended like a meteor. The Kirathon, in response, shot hundreds of tendrils upward, approaching Northern's form with sheer obliterating force. As both onslaughts collided, a supersonic reverberation tore through the space, its incandescent light drowning the night in day for a blinking moment. Before everything returned to the way it was a moment before, Northern, unrelenting, was already behind the monster. He had used the blinding light as cover to escape the monster's troublesome eyes. It was one of the few things he had observed about the horror. Even though he wasn't using all eyes at the moment, his keen observation and precaution had earned him a habit of its own. And that was why he was able to tell, in the nick of time, just how glued the horror's eyes were on him. This allowed every one of his attacks to be anticipated, expected. He couldn't tell how exactly that played out, but it wouldn't be too far-fetched, considering that the Kirathon was a monster that dealt mental attacks. Maybe it had some semblance of intelligence. And maybe that was why it knew where to look, where to defend, and where to focus its regenerative ability. That regenerative ability, in particular, had been a pain for Northern. Attacks that desecrated trees and turned them to dust particles, this monster was recovering at an alarming rate. And it was managing to live through every one of Kaal's devastating onslaughts. It had more than already proved the might of a maelstrom rank monster. And Northern, in fact, was forgetting that it wasn't just a maelstrom rank monster but an apex predator amongst its kind. Northern appeared behind the colossal Kirathon, his hands shrouded in the flowing cloth of intense crimson energy, sizzling with black sparks. The air seized and flew back, making the environment around him airless for a tiny moment. In that moment, however, Northern, without hesitation, slammed both palms into the monster from the rear, unleashing a devastating torrent of crimson lances that tore into its flesh. Having successfully evaded the monster and appeared at its blind spot, the attack was allowed to bite deep into the monster's body, such that it reflected a burning light before blasting out of its abdomen, leaving a little chunk of flesh on the side to hold its upper body. Northern immediately narrowed his eyes, mentally sending a command to both his clones that were on standby. The two dark sentinels, without any prior hint, dashed into the distance like bullets, streaking in and out of the raging disaster of Northern's attack and approaching the monster with frightening presence. Both of them materialized two different weapons, the mortal blade in one's hand, the soul taker in another. Approaching the Kirathon, they released a barrage of arcs that adorned the horror like azure lines, almost looking like the crude awakening of a constellation that brought nothing but destruction and death. With the carving attacks, the Kirathon let out another bellow. This time, its screaming voice sounded more hurt than intimidating. From the screech one could tell it had taken significant damage. Finally, the hands it had burrowed into the ground began to move. The monster was clearly up to something. Not gonna let you. Northern had already prepared another cataclysmic attack while his clones moved. In fact, the role of his clones was to buy a tiny bit of time and prevent the monster from regenerating rapidly before he dealt it another finishing blow. This one was supposed to be the last one. He would gather all the power he could summon in Kaal's soul and condense it to one single point. After almost severing the monster's body from the flower bud-like pericarp that housed its lower body, this attack was supposed to completely render its core useless. In the time that the monster would be using to regenerate, he was going to blast its cores. All 4 cores. He would aim his attack directly at that point. And because the horror would be busy regenerating, it wouldn't be able to defend itself. Maybe to a degree it would. But it couldn't be compared to its initial prowess at defense. Whichever way, this attack was either going to deal critical damage or end it for good. Whatever the results were, Northern was ready to accept them. A complex array of crimson lances began to weave itself into Northern's front, each one imbued with a potent concentration of Kaal's crimson soul essence. The air crackled with the intensity of his power, and for a moment, the Kirathon paused, sensing the imminent threat. Its body was already burning up flesh, viscera crawling eerily, in desperation to hold its body together, purple blood flowing like a waterfall, bathing the surrounding in a corrosive gore. As it sensed the potent threat that Northern's attack posed, the Kirathon roared in defiance, its massive hands lashing out with blinding speed. Northern immediately gritted his teeth. Then quickly, with a mighty sweep of his hands, Northern unleashed his attack. The crimson lances exploded outward in different directions, converging on the Kirathon in a dazzling display of light and energy. The monster tried to retaliate, but its attacks were swallowed up by the sheer force of Northern's onslaught. The ground trembled as the Kirathon's body was torn apart, its regenerative abilities overwhelmed by the relentless barrage. Massive chunks of flesh were ripped away, revealing 4 pulsing cores at the creature's heart. Northern, immediately seeing it, narrowed his eyes. The crimson lances were as if they had a life of their own. They didn't stop raining down on the monster. They flew around like fairy devils, tearing its flesh and wearing down the monster's regenerative abilities. But it was not going to be enough because the Kirathon was still managing to heal and still very fast, although not as fast as before, which was why Northern deduced that he needed to strike the cores, and materialized another round of crimson lances, intensifying his essence on them so much that they were glowing with a blinding white light. Helena and Terence watched from afar, a tense frown licking the feral sage's face. Terence clutched Helena's arm tightly, her eyes darkened by both terror and awe. I have never seen an ordinary drifter fight like this. A pearl of sweat trickled down Helena's temple as she forced a side grin and muttered to herself. At this rate, this guy might really kill an apex maelstrom. I'd be damned. Chapter 245. Live to fight another day. Raven gritted her teeth, her eyes narrowing as she focused her attention on the thralls, deflecting their attacks with graceful, precise movements. She could feel the shock waves of Northern's onslaught rippling through the air and knew she had to be careful not to get caught in the crossfire. She twirled into the air and swung her blade, causing the heads of 3 thralls to roll in the wake of her sword. Then she landed on one knee and looked ahead, staring at the whitish glow that Northern held in his hands as he took a javelin thrower's stance, ready to obliterate the enemy before him. She stared at him with a slight frown above her brows. Was he hiding his powers all along? But there's no way he would have known that the Karasuno was following him. It was exactly as she had said. The Kageyama clan practiced an ancient technique of surveillance called Karasuno. It was a passed-down technique where one needed their essence to activate it. Once activated, the technique takes on a near-life form, able to act as a black crow that traces its target without being noticed. All it needed to stay hidden was the presence of soul essence. As long as its target had soul essence, it could never be seen unless the user willed it so. Through the eyes of the black crow, it was possible to see what the target was doing. Through the mouth of the black crow, it was possible to have a conversation with the target. And through the feather of the black crow, it was possible to pass an inked message. Of course, this was just a family arts technique since they were a notorious clan of assassins. It had nothing to do with Raven's ability nor her talent. And it was a perfect technique that not even an ascendant should be able to see, except an exceptional few. Raven was very sure Northern, by every means possible, was not part of that exceptional few. So what exactly had transpired? The young lady was drowning in a lot of confusion, and it was becoming distracting. Raven let out a sigh and looked away, facing the scant number of thralls that remained. She had single-handedly dealt with over 100 of them, and not even a single scratch marred her body. Suddenly, the entire landscape shuddered. That was when Northern's intensified crimson lances, glowing with a blinding white light, streaked towards the Kirathon's 4 pulsing cores. The monster tried to retaliate, but its entire form was already overwhelmed by Northern's prior onslaught, its flesh incessantly being rendered asunder. As the lances struck the cores, a deafening explosion rocked the area. The Kirathon let out an agonizing roar, its massive body convulsing violently. Northern watched intently, waiting to see if his attack had been decisive. Slowly, the Kirathon's movements began to slow, its regenerative abilities faltering. Northern narrowed his eyes, sensing an opportunity. Gathering the last of his strength, he charged forward, his hands wreathed in crimson energy. "This ends now," Northern bellowed, slamming his palms into the Kirathon's weakened form. The monster lunged its hands and tendrils forward, but its attacks were feeble. With a flick of his hand, Northern warded them away. Then he tore into the Kirathon's body with his hands covered in dancing red flames, ripping through its flesh and reaching for its core. However, Northern's eyes suddenly furrowed. He deepened his hands further into the now dying body of the monster, a deep frown now contorting his face. The monster's massive form lifelessly dropped to the ground, expunging a cloud of dust and smashing debris into splinters around. Northern removed his hands. They were empty. He looked at his purple-soaked hands, then raised his eyes to the monster's corpse. By this time, Kal's soul was wearing off, and he was slowly reverting to his original body. "Wow!
I'm enthralled.
You are totally on another level." Helena's voice resounded with jubilation as she approached Northern. She was with Terence, who was still staring at Northern with so much awe radiating from her eyes. Raven was still far behind, but she seemed to have finished cleaning up as her swords turned into sparkles and disappeared. The veil that covered the light was finally uplifted, and scarlet light was subtly leaking from the horizon. Northern, with a pale face, turned to them. He didn't have to speak. His facial expression was enough to warrant an immense amount of concern from Helena and Terence. "Hey, Flower Boy, are you okay? You just defeated an Apex Maelstrom rank monster. That's not quite the face for celebration." Northern looked at the massive dead body and looked at Helena. Then he shook his head slightly and said, "It didn't die." At this point, Raven was closer to them so she could hear what he was saying. "What do you mean?" Northern's voice rang tiredly. "I tried to take the core. It's not there anymore." Helena squinted her eyes for a moment. "It's possible that your attack could have destroyed its core." Raven shook her head and entered the conversation. "A soul core is indestructible. Something is off here." She looked at Northern for a few moments and asked, "Are you certain it died?" Northern was silent for a couple of seconds. Apart from the absence of the soul cores, he never received any fragments. None at all. Which meant that the Kirathon was very much alive. He closed his eyes and shook his head as he responded. "No. I see." Raven too was silent for a while. Then she said, "Chances are that it has run away." Helena tilted her head back and scratched her hair, groaning angrily. "Arg, this is annoying. How does that even work?" Raven looked at her. "Since we haven't encountered many Maelstrom rank monsters of Apex level, not much can be said. We've not, in fact, encountered many Apex level monsters, and it's Apex level. That level itself means anything is possible." Northern stayed aloof for a while. Then he returned his eyes and apologized. "I'm sorry. I should have been more careful." He bowed his head slightly to Helena. He had promised her to end the creature's life, and now, he couldn't help but be washed with a torrent of embarrassment due to how overconfident he was back then. Raven lowered her head slightly to Helena and clenched her fist. "If you decide that you are not going with us, I will understand." Helena, with her eyes widened and blank, looked at Northern, then turned to Raven and turned to Northern again before resounding. "Are you guys crazy? Flower Boy, you practically obliterated that thing alone. And you think I'm not already satisfied?" She gave Raven a knock on her head, causing her to frown slightly and look up. "You can stop with the nonsense act. You know already that I am following you on this journey, and besides, hell, in no way will I let you go away with my precious map." She looked around. It was subtle, but they could now hear chatters and steps. Of course, with the destruction of this level, even if the entire area was covered in the monster's veil, it was impossible that the main city didn't sense or feel anything. It was only a matter of time before they reached here. Helena's brows furrowed a little. "Now, if we don't want to face more complications than we have at hand, I think we better get moving," she urged them. With that, the cohort took hasty steps forward. Northern paused and looked back at the monster's corpse with a vicious glare on his face before joining the others in front. After they left, four worms crawled out of the monster's body, merged into one, and burrowed into the soil. Chapter 246. A Dangerous Flower Boy. Step, step. Slowly their legs slowed down as they approached the center of the woods. They'd been especially skeptical about entering due to its history of abducting humans. Their leader, however, a gaunt man with dark brown dreadlock tresses, had acted as the morale booster of the group and led them into the heart of this disaster. He, after all, was one of the distinguished men of Afghan, and was strong enough to have earned himself such a position. He stood in front of everyone and was the first one to stop in his tracks as he laid eyes on the numerous craters that bit into the ground, and the one at the center that served as a great mother to the ones surrounding it. Bodies of people lay sprawled around the area, and at the center of the cataclysmic destruction was a withered body, one as large as a house. The man, Shade, stared at this war-torn environment with a pained frown on his face. His voice shook as words managed to escape his mouth. How? Who could have done something of this magnitude? Helena? He paused for a moment and shook his head. No, Helena is strong, but she can't defeat the Kirathon. She has tried too many times, and it has all been futile. He turned his small eyes to look at the lifeless bodies lying around. His eyes widened as a light of recognition ignited in their black depths. His legs hurried forward, and he fell beside the first fallen. His hands paused and trembled as he attempted to touch the fallen lady. Brows furrowed tightly, his face contorting with sorrow. The eyes of the feminine body were open and glassy, black veins visible beneath her pale skin. Every part of her insinuated that she had undergone a drastic change before being cut down. But this man didn't look like he was willing to accept the fact, because this woman was someone they had fought side by side with, someone who was their comrade, his comrade. No one, especially not Helena, should have cut her down under any circumstance. She could have been captured and brought back to the main city, or better still, knocked out. Different thoughts ran helter-skelter through Shade's mind. He was slowly heaving and fuming. The air around him was tethered with heaviness such that his subordinates were slowly taking steps backward. But suddenly, a man appeared, making everything disappear in a blink. The air was free to roam. The pressure disappeared, and the entire place seemed even freer than before. The man had blonde hair and blue eyes. His hair was wavy and shoulder-length. His skin was light brown with a warm golden undertone. He had an accommodating and heroic ambience to his presence, and even his chain mail armor was radiating a holy presence despite its commonplace. Shade raised his eyes and calmed down. Then he stood up. With a slight frown, he asked, "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be beside Afghan?" The man shook his head, causing his blonde hair to move gently. "No. Afghan himself asked me to come here and check things out." He looked at the corpses, the craters, the disintegrated trees, and the body of the monster lying in the middle. The man was silent for a couple of seconds before commenting. He said, "Whoever did this." He was definitely taking his time speaking. In fact, it doesn't even look like a fight between a drifter and a monster. It looks like a battle between two monsters. He looked down at the corpses. However, these are sword marks. Then he went silent again, his eyes staying on the monster's enormous form for a little while longer. Shade's voice rang out. "What if it's really a drifter?" He turned his eyes to the blonde-haired man. The man was silent for a while more, after which he sighed and opened his mouth slightly. "Shade, if it is a drifter, then there will be a lot of problems, especially should Afghan find out. It would be wise to get rid of the person silently." He paused and heaved another sigh. "But then, someone who caused a disaster of this level, I doubt it will be possible to get rid of him silently. How about we involve the Empire in this matter?" Shade nodded. "That seems like the best course of action. We don't want Afghan running rampant. The White Knight Order, at the very least, would be able to handle this without any problem." "Yes," the man responded. You should compile a report to send to the Empire. Leave Afghan to me. With that, the man tapped Shade's shoulders and walked away, taking 3 to 4 steps before vanishing into the wind. Shade let out a deep breath, touched his soothing chest, and looked at the afterimage of the man, questioning silently. How does he even do that? Silence ensued for the next few minutes. Then he turned around to look at the monster's corpse. What are you wusses doing? Get moving already. We are moving the monster's corpse. This is a huge pile of meat. Remember? The faces of other drifters became pale with terror. Damn. How are we supposed to move something so enormous? They murmured amongst themselves. Phew. I think we are far enough. Helena commented as she glanced back. Northern, narrowing his eyes, asked, what exactly were we running from? While they were on their way out of the stronghold, heading towards the dark tunnel, Helena suddenly froze. The next moment, she urged them to hastily move and get as far away as they could. This caused them to begin running. Even Terence the Tender Oracle had to run her ass off. Eventually, after getting close to the cave tunnel, they stopped, with Helena panting heavily. Northern was sure running a couple of meters couldn't have possibly worn her out like that. He was still steadily breathing, and she was a sage. More was expected from her, which meant that there was probably something she was seriously trying to get away from. Helena looked at him and managed to steady her breath. Ah, there's another flower boy, one that is a serious pain in the ass. I felt his presence. I'm not sure if he felt ours. Even if he did, he won't be willing to come this far since he has to be closer to Afghan than he is farther from him. Raven frowned. Zephyr. Helena turned her eyes to Raven. Yes. Now let's keep going. She paused and turned to Northern and extended her hand. Before that, hand me the map. There's no way. Sure. Northern put his hands into his armor to retrieve the map, but suddenly his eyes widened. All his body trembled with cold fear. His face became pale, and his voice stuttered as words came out, shakily. It's gone. Lo and behold, Northern had lost the map. Chapter 247, Ousted by Knowledge. Helena gazed at him, dumbfounded. She watched as Northern began to scurry around, searching his body for the black scroll. He was joking, he had to be joking. Helena found her mouth and eyes wide open, unable to close them no matter how much she tried. And yet words failed her in that moment. What was she to say exactly? This guy. Northern lowered his head in shame, frowning underneath. I don't know, it must have been during the fight. Maybe I was careless. He wanted to say more but stopped and ground his teeth. He didn't even know how it worked. Call's body overwrote his own. Could it have been possible that the map was expelled from his body during the process? Or had it simply fallen during his fight with the Kirathon, and he didn't even notice it happen? He was utterly confused, annoyed, and disgusted with himself for making such a stupid mistake happen. He definitely knew for sure that the map was a crucial material for their travel. It was the reason why they were going in the first place. And yet, Northern felt a harrowing pain as he thought about it. Meanwhile, Raven and Terence just stared at him in silence. Raven had her usual indifferent expression, while Terence seemed slightly dumbfounded. After a while, Raven averted her gaze from him, turning to Helena. Then she asked, "Does this mean we won't be able to go anymore?" Helena stood with arms akimbo, lingering while staring keenly at Raven. She exhaled, then responded, "You see. What do you think I am?" Not waiting for Raven's response, she continued, "I am a chronic explorer. With or without the map, I can take you to the Sleeping Mountains, although with the map, it will be much safer." Her eyes went down for barely a second, then she looked at Raven. "But first, arrogant girl." She lingered for half a second. "You have to tell me what it is exactly you are looking for. Enough tricks, we are your cohort. What is it exactly you are trying to achieve by going to the Sleeping Mountains?" All of them turned their heads to Raven. At this point she became the center of attention. She closed her eyes calmly and opened them, exhaling at the same moment. Do you want us to speak here? Or isn't it at least safe to go as far away from here as we can? Helena looked around. The entire place was clouded by the morning fog, so it was particularly hard to see through. But they were close to the rocky areas where Raven had knocked out and hidden some guards. The fact was, they were still knocked out. Probably had a blissful night to boot. Helena brought her eyes to Raven. No, I want you to speak here and now. Besides, this much is safe enough. If that damned flower boy could sense us, he would be here already. She inhaled and exhaled, then continued, if we will be going without the map, you all will need to trust me. We need to get our goals in sync and understand that we have a common goal. That is the only way to establish trust, at least temporarily. She glared at Raven towards the end of her statement. Raven then nodded slightly and retorted, all right then. If you insist, I will speak about it. She paused and stretched out her hand a little. Then white lights sparkled to life on her palm, weaving out a square shape of light. When the light finally dimmed, a book was revealed. No, it wasn't just a book. It was a leather-bound book with a cracked cover and silver-reinforced spine. It was definitely a tome. Northern had no idea what it was, but Helena could tell at a glance. Immediately, her voice rang out. Hey, hey, hey! What the hell are you doing with that? Northern looked at Helena, figuring at the slight confusion he was having. Terence leaned towards him and whispered, that is a tome. You know, tomes? But there are two types of tomes. Knowledge tomes and art tomes. She was silent for a little, inspecting intently the cover of the book. Judging by the words on it, I think it's a knowledge tome. With slightly widened eyes, Northern looked at Terence and inquired, you can read whatever is on it? I thought tomes are from rifts. Do they have the same language as we do? Terence turned her eyes to him with a soft, sweet smile gracing her lips. Then she said, I am a vessel of an inconsiderable amount of soul essence, far closer to all than anyone on this continent is. Of course, I am multilingual. Northern squinted his eyes for a second and looked away with a disgusted face, muttering, yeah, sure. Raven's voice came out. This is the tome of Alvar Viti. Helena raised a brow. Alvar Viti, as in the Epic of Tyranny. Raven nodded her head with a little smile. As expected, I am not surprised you know that much. Northern exchanged glances between Raven and Helena. Both of them looked like they were on the same page, and he wasn't quite there. In fact, he was far from there. He understood not a damn thing they were talking about. What did she mean by Epic of Tyranny? What the hell was Alvar Viti? What language is that? Riftian or common language? Terence looked at his face and shook her head. You really have a long way to go in your pursuit of knowledge, she said. Raven looked at Northern sternly as she continued, just as Terence concluded. For Northern's sake, I think we should talk about certain things, such as the Rift and its history with the epics, tomes, and tyrants too. Helena looked at the outcast among them and shook her head. You really do not know about all these things, at least epics. Northern shamefully shook his head. He was slowly growing tired of being asked this question and even beginning to resent his parents and question why they hid all this knowledge from him. We are going to have that conversation should I return home safe and sound, he gritted inwardly. Raven looked at Helena and said, since you are so vast in the history of rifts, I think you should explain this to him. Helena scratched her head a little and sighed. Fine. She looked at Northern. Pay attention, flower boy. This is going to be a long explanation. Chapter 248. Understanding Epics, Part 1. Helena lingered for a moment before she continued. She looked at Northern for a second with her bright brown eyes before she finally started. First I'll start with rifts. This should be easy since you have been in a rift before, right? Northern nodded. Many might have made the proposition that rifts are different dimensional worlds that have been infected by the same disease. It does seem like that, doesn't it? Northern nodded in agreement this time. After all, even he had thought like that. Interestingly, Helena continued, yes, but it's not really like that. The thing is, it's not many worlds. The rift is one world. Northern looked at her intently, some words on the tip of his tongue. Helena studied him for a while before continuing. I know you're probably thinking that can't be true. What about the distinct cultures and diversity in each rift? Yes, indeed. That makes it quite hard to believe that the rifts were just one dimension. But let me continue my explanation. Northern listened. The rift is proposed by more intelligent scholars and experienced explorers like myself to be a convoluted world. But it's different. It's different from the thought that they are an infection, that maybe after they overtake a certain dimension, that dimension becomes a rift too. No, I don't think it works that way. When you study the ancient murals, if you've come across them in different rifts, you find the common link between the history of the world in relation to certain beings that are known to be the originators of the world, the origins of the first world. A spark of understanding ignited in Northern's eyes. Somehow, all that Kahl was trying to say was making its way back into his head. When the maelstrom was referring to origins, did he really mean a deity of some sort? Abandoning his thoughts, Northern brought his focus back to Helena. You see, the rift is believed to be the first world to ever exist. It is a world that combines all worlds that have ever existed. But I believe that something must have really happened to it. She folded her hands and stood confidently as she continued to explain to Northern. Epochs are basically eras in the world of the rift. Do you know that no active way to enter rifts or make them appear has been created? Or at least none that I know of. And I firmly believe that it is currently impossible to do so because when rifts appear, they just don't appear. It's like their time and space is tearing into our time and space, so what I'm trying to say is that there are several epochs in a rift, and each epoch had a predominant event, a culture, an origin, and more things like that. When rifts appear, contrary to what we think, that they share the same timeline as what is happening in our own world, it's not really like that. She paused to ask Northern a question. Flower boy, have you ever seen a human in a rift? A human? One like yourself? Northern thought for a while and shook his head.
No.
Exactly. But it's possible for humans to be in rifts. How, you ask me? Because the first world also consisted of the first set of beings. Can you tell me what you have proposed to be the history of the rift you were in? Northern thought for a moment and opened his mouth. Well, there was the Red Mine, which I believe was always a kingdom, but the king sold his people for power and became a monster. Instead of becoming the guardian of the rift itself, the king became the core, and the power, having overtaken the king's place, became the guardian of some sort. Helena's eyes squinted as she listened to Northern. She shook her head when he was done. No, it doesn't quite work that way. I bet there was some sort of anomaly in the rift you were in, which cannot be out of place considering it's one of the rifts that appeared suddenly. Northern narrowed his eyes. What do you propose then? I don't know for sure, but monsters are a core part of rifts. They are a civilization too. That is just how vast and complex the first world was. It's as big as a convoluted combination of the other worlds, which is why the ancient tomes call it a convoluted world. Now, when they appear in our own space, they appear with their epoch. Imagine it more like a portal opens up in space and you're going to yesterday, or another portal opens up, and you are going to the day after tomorrow. Northern raised a brow. It was a complicated proposition. He was prompted to challenge it. He spoke. But doesn't that mean there wouldn't be a true existence of the monsters? If they are from the past, doesn't that mean they have already existed? No, it doesn't quite work like that, flower boy. You see, when trying to understand the concept of the rift, you are not allowed to judge it based on the concept of our world. These monsters are still real, whether they exist from the past or the future. They're real enough to kill you, at least. Northern got the point she was trying to make. What mattered was that if you don't act quickly, thinking they are unreal, well, you know the stakes. Another reason why it would be inconsistent to call them unreal was because of Mr. Fluffy. Mr. Fluffy, which he found in that rift, had continued to exist just as a normal, real beast-rank monster. Helena continued. And so, there are several epochs. Wait, I think we have a good understanding of this. Northern lingered for a second, then responded, I do have a lot of questions, though. Of course, even I do, too. These are things I learned from studying murals and ancient tomes, I have so many questions, which is why I can't stop exploring. For example, I'm still very curious about how vast the first world is. I'm also curious as to whether rifts are a phenomenon caused by a defect of the first world due to a mishap between origins and tyrants, or if rifts are an actual phenomenon on their own that is bound to infect other worlds, just like it has infected the first world. Northern gulped. Surely, Helena's level of knowledge was far superior to his. But maybe this journey would allow him to learn some things. He'd finally be able to know about these origins Call was talking about and whether the Chaos Prince was an origin too. I just wanted to know. What are origins? Are they deities? Chapter 249. Understanding Epics, Part 2. Raven answered his question. Not quite, she said, lingering for a moment before adding. They are believed to be a personification of some sort, like the personification of the moon, the personification of the sun, the personification of happiness, sadness. There are quite a lot of them, and they are referred to as origins, although the whole concept and history between them goes much deeper than that. If there is anything that would be close to the concept of deities, I think that would be tyrants. Northern looked at her. What is that? Tyrants are known to be humans who walked the path of power and became the strongest beings of the first world, humans that attained things like immortality and powers on the level of origins. They began to be worshipped by people, and that was when the origins surfaced. Northern, drowning in confusion, looked at the two of them and inquired in strange amazement. How do you both know so much? I thought you guys haven't been into rifts in this place. Helena raised her brows. Huh? Do you think the history of rifts started in this land? Be it Central Plains or anywhere, it's all the same, but diverse, broken puzzles that need to be pieced together. Helena raised her chin, a smug grin appearing on her face as she added. Besides, I majored in rift historiography while I was in the academy, even though I didn't finish thanks to a certain jerk. Northern looked at Helena for a while. Wow, you are so cool. And you're wrong too. Northern looked at her. Huh. Helena grimaced a little. You're wrong saying that I haven't been into rifts. How else do you think we were able? We just didn't enter the cardinal rifts. But apart from the cardinal rifts, there were always lower-tier rifts that appeared every now and then in the past 10 years, and we quickly challenged them. Northern narrowed his eyes. So you guys are indeed running from something? Helena was silent for a while. Then she scratched her head and let out a slight, frustrated groan. Yeah, whatever. Back to the matter, this tome knowledge you are looking at, Flower Boy, is a journal from the epic of Alvervidi, the War of Fate. Raven picked up the explanation. The tome was written in an era where a war to decide the fate of the world was fought. The kings of monsters and kings of humans clashed with each other. Before this time, there had been an existence of peace. But that balance was tipped. We don't know by who, though. The book suggests that it was a wandering tyrant. But the claim was inconsistent with facts because the traces of tyrants had long disappeared before this particular epoch. I see. So Alvervidi is the term for War of Fate. Raven nodded. Then how does any of this relate to what you are going to do in these sleeping mountains? While reading and studying this tome, I found something quite strange was mentioned. A mountain blinded by white clouds. One that the lost wonders and the sleeping never wakes. Helena's eyes widened a little. The sleeping mountain? Raven turned her head to the feral sage and nodded. Paled by curiosity, Helena's voice rang out. How? Isn't this supposed to be a rift item? Tomes address rifts in particular, don't they? Raven nodded. Exactly. Fortunately, I wasn't the first person to find this tome. The Lord of Lotherlywan had also seen this and went to the sleeping mountain to investigate exactly what was happening. She paused a little. But he never came back. Helena looked at her. How are you so sure about that? You are talking so confidently about people you didn't meet. I have the journal of his squire, who was the only one that managed to return. She paused and looked at Northern as she continued. On a flying ship. Helena paid rapt attention to her words, thinking about them, while Northern scrunched up his eyes. Then why is the flying ship not at Lothellowan? Because he attempted to go back. That was the end of his journal. So wait, what if the ship was destroyed along with the Lord's squire? The air was silent. Then Raven responded to Northern. He gave some countermeasures for recovering the ship, to whomever found his journal, and left the last words. Let the purpose of the ship serve to preserve and protect your life from harm. She paused and added, he also said those were the words imprinted on the ship's description. It's a really strange item. Where did they get an airship as an item? Raven shrugged. How would I know? She continued. What I do know is that contrary to what we think, the people around when this disaster started actually tried their best to save their kingdoms. It just was futile. Which is why I am going to continue from where they left off. Helena's voice spoke lowly. And where they left off is the Sleeping Mountains. Raven looked at her and nodded. I believe that investigating what the Sleeping Mountains has in common with these words in the tome from the Epic of Alverviti would grant us deeper insight into what is going on. And I believe the Lord of Lothelowin must have thought so too. Helena nodded, her hands below her chin as she seemed deep in thought, before she looked at Raven and asked, and so Raven, where is this journal? It's with Gilbert, but I tore out the important pages. She dipped her hand into her belt area and brought out a brown folded paper, extending it to Helena. Helena slowly opened the paper, her eyes reading for a couple of minutes. By this time, the day was bright. Then she smiled and passed the pages to Northern. After reading the notes, Northern looked at Raven. Everything there was just as she had claimed. There was no lie or deceit. She sighed and looked at Northern. With your clones, I have a plan that would allow us to survive the Sleeping Mountains. Chapter 250. Courage is not the absence of fear, Part 1. Thanks to Helena's pathfinding abilities, they didn't need to pass through the dark cave. The darkness in that cave still made Northern uncomfortable to this day. However, they had to climb a small cliff. This was when Northern's rock climbing abilities came into play. It was déjà vu. How could he be so good at climbing? He was sure the others would have wondered. It made him grin smugly. But this was just a skill he had been forced to develop from hanging out with Night Terror. And even this cliff they had to climb was nothing compared to the mountain he and Night Terror had scaled. Instead of going through the tunnel, it seemed Helena took them over it. Even she hated the darkness as much as everyone else, which was why she chose this route. They soon reached the other side of the stronghold. And throughout the climbing up and down, Northern couldn't stop thinking about the things they had discussed. Things were much more complicated than he thought. And his suspicion was, the Chaos Prince was probably a tyrant. But were tyrants powerful enough to blot out the sun? And also, the man that came out from the sun and summoned the maidens, could that have been an origin or just another tyrant? Kal's master, as he claimed, was an origin. What was he addressed as again? If there was anything Northern could at the very least boast of, it was his detailed memory. The origin of blood. No. His eyes slowly widened as the correct words aligned in his head. The blood tyrant, hunter of souls, father of chaos, origin of courage, honor, strength, hate and blood. At that time he had thought Kal, the castle lord, was just showering praises on the one he served. But what if every word and title Kal uttered actually had a deeper meaning? Would that mean Kal served a tyrant? But he also referred to him as the greatest origin to ever exist. What is going on here? Northern felt like he just confused himself more. Was it really possible for one to be a tyrant and origin at the same time? No, origins were supposed to be some sort of personified beings, not actual humans. Tyrants, on the other hand, were humans. Was it possible to become an origin without being born as one? There were a lot of questions running around his mind as he climbed down the cliff. The morning weather was still pleasant on them, at least for now the daylight was not harsh. As their legs touched the ground, Northern hesitated for a moment, then said, I have some things to say, some things to ask too. Helena, Raven and Terence all focused on him with curiosity etched on their faces. The intensity of their gazes on him almost made him shiver. He couldn't help but feel a little intimidated, especially towards Helena, who was probably closer to him in true age. Her gaze was mature and insightful, although her lithe and tender body could mislead anyone. First, I will say this, and I don't want you guys to ask me weird questions. Helena narrowed her eyes suspiciously at him. Then she said, coincidentally with Raven and Terence. Okay. Northern looked at all three of them before continuing. The Rift Guardian I fought with was an imprisoned servant of a certain origin. An origin named Corn. Raven looked at Helena, who looked back. Both turned their heads to Northern with a slight show of amusement, more noticeable on Helena's face than Raven's. Terence, on the other hand, just chuckled shyly. You have heard the name of an origin. Northern turned to her. Haven't you? Isn't that what all this is about? Helena threw her head back and laughed with shuddering shoulders. The farthest I've ever been able to discover is knowing what origins are and what tyrants are, and that much was from this particular tome and the way it spoke about them in past tense. Northern looked at them for a few seconds. Helena also shook her head. It's just as you heard, Flower Boy. We've never heard of it before. In murals, all I can study are pictorial representations, and I happen to come by the term origin from a certain item I have. Same thing with tyrant. I've got about 3 items with a description that featured tyrants. But never did it mention a particular name. As compared to how Northern could hear an item's description, drifters could also see it by listening to the voice of Alvaru. That was their way of knowing the item rank and other details. So it wasn't surprising that Helena knew a thing or two about descriptions relating to Rift events. Northern thought silently for a while before Helena interrupted. So, want to tell us more? She allowed a delighted smile. Northern looked at her and nodded. The Blood Tyrant, Hunter of Souls, Father of Chaos, Origin of Courage, Honor, Strength, Hate and Blood. He called him the greatest origin to ever exist, and the one he served. Helena caressed her chin. Wait, something is wrong with that. Raven added. I've studied the tome thoroughly, and I can confidently say that servants of origins were not once mentioned. And not much was said about tyrants except the tyrant of 1,000 waters. Northern looked at her. Have you heard anything about a certain Chaos Prince? Raven shook her head. No, is that another origin? No, it's nothing. Terence looked at him and retorted immediately. You're lying. But it's fine if you don't want to talk about it. Northern was immediately startled as he remembered he was journeying with a talking lie detector. Crap. Helena looked at his pale face and said, It's nothing out of the ordinary. All of us have secrets. Just make sure it's not getting in the way or putting our lives in danger. Northern nodded with a stern gaze and responded. It's not. Fine then, Flower Boy. Helena tapped his shoulder and added, I'm not sure about this Blood Tyrant being referred to again as an origin. So far it contradicts all the knowledge I've gathered about origins. But it's great that you decided to share it with us. I think we should expect revelations from the Sleeping Mountain. She looked ahead. For now, we travel. But she paused and looked at Raven. Wait, before I forget. If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned a flying ship, right? Chapter 251. Courage is not the absence of fear, Part 2. I believe I mentioned that. Raven replied. Helena cocked her head. It's Northern's best bet at leaving this place unharmed. Helena was silent for a while. She then chuckled deviously and shifted her focus to Northern. You know of a safe way out of this cursed continent, and you're going to keep its existence a secret and give it to Northern. She glared at him. Revealing the existence of a flying ship could cause a civil war between both strongholds. That is one thing we cannot afford right now. She paused and continued. Moreover, I want to believe there is a cruel reason why the Luengard Empire is not letting people into their country. It's obvious they know they are our best bet at getting out of this damned place, but yet they do not grant us access. What if they hear about the ship and it becomes a threat to them? Helena lingered for a while and nodded subtly. Your thinking is sound there. No good will come from revealing it to the public. Raven turned her eyes to Northern and added, Besides, I believe Northern more than anyone deserves a way out of this desolation. He has had it rough, although we have too, but at the very least we had each other to rely on. Who knows what being alone has done to him? Her eyes turned somber at the end. Northern seethed inwardly. I feel very pissed being pitted by this girl. For some reason, all her words are sounding condescending. Helena looked at him, puzzled, but she shrugged and said, "If you say so, but I'll say this. You see, Northern, one thing I hate is that the principal was right about. This hellhole is a furnace that would forge you into your best version. Why not get stronger before returning?" Northern narrowed his eyes. "Every corner here looms with death. You do know that rifts are also in the central plains. I can go back and get stronger safely." Helena's face became somber. "I see. That's it. Huh." A frown creased Northern's face. "That's what? What?" Helena looked away from him with no response, causing Northern to persist. "What do you mean by that?" Something about the last look she gave him was unsettling. "Are you judging me?" he yelled. "Judging you? Nope, not at all." Helena looked at him and continued, "We are in a hellhole, flower boy. Everyone is allowed to have fears and allowed to choose to run away from those fears or fight them." She paused and looked at Northern, her eyes somber again. "I've never seen someone pretending they don't exist, trying so hard to hide them with logic. I thought you were impressive earlier, but it seems I was mistaken. With all that strength, is this how weak your mentality is? Have you ever thought about what happens next after you reach the Central Plains? What will the principal do? Or what will people do? Will you be accepted or will you have to fight for your place? Which would be much easier if you just exercise patience and grow stronger here." Northern's frown deepened. "Don't do that. Don't act like you know me or you're some expert at reading people. Don't do that because you don't know what I've lived through to be alive. And what would a few more times give? Why do you have to be so guarded about your fears? You don't have to block them out like they don't exist. You're scared of dying. You want to get your butt out of here as soon as you can. Go back to the embrace of your parents. Live your life like a normal kid, just like you've always imagined. And flower boy, there's nothing wrong with that. You're young, heck. Are you even 18 yet?" Northern felt a bitter pang in his throat. Helena was talking to him as if she thought he was 18 years old at best. But in reality, his mentality, at least up until now, was supposed to be much older, as old as hers. It stung hard. Hiding his fears, pretending they don't exist? He had no fears. However, right now, even Northern was having a hard time believing that himself. Even though he had gained tremendous strength, had the events in the rift traumatized him more than he expected? He thought he was fine. But all the while, was he pretending to himself? Thinking that going home was the only way out of this hell? He wanted to survive. Sure, yes. But did it have to be by running away? Northern frowned and dropped his head, clenching his fists tightly and saying nothing. The others stared silently at him. After a couple of minutes, it was starting to get a bit awkward among the group. But Helena turned towards the direction of the tall tower that usually served as a compass of sorts for her during her travels. Her eyes, however, plunged much farther than that. She pointed forward and said, "We are going still far. You see those backdrop of mountains marking the horizon we are looking at right now." She looked back over her shoulder and grinned. "That will be the beginning of our journey." She then turned around fully, was silent for a while, and then looked at Northern. "Look, I'd advise you to go back at this point. You're probably just better off somewhere safe. Okay. Maybe you don't know how perilous this journey is about to get." She inhaled and exhaled. "I'll tell you. You see, the map would have provided us with diverse travel options and ways to choose. Since it has every area marked out, our travel would have been relatively safe." She paused. "At least with the map we would choose and know the danger we are walking into. But without it, we just have to confront whatever hits us." She looked deeper into his eyes. "So this could actually be the most dangerous situation you have ever ventured into, perhaps even far more dangerous than you have ever faced. The Sleeping Mountains is the location of the last cardinal rift, and it's a Tier 4 rift." She paused for a second and continued. "I suppose the rift you entered was something around that level, But don't be quick to judge riffs. The tier system is just based on soul essence readings. What you could meet inside could be way more dangerous than anything you've faced. So you'd be foolish to think you can take it on, just because you have before. She put her arms akimbo. Actually, I think you're better off leaving. What do you say? Want to crawl back to your hole, flower boy? Chapter 252. Courage is not the absence of fear, Part 3. Northern's head was still lowered. His hands were so tightly clenched that his fingers were digging into his palms, and he didn't seem to care. All that Helena said was strangely annoying, grating. He walked forward with a deep frown and muttered, "Let's go." Helena looked at him with a blank expression. Raven walked forward too. Stopping beside her, she commented, "Did you have to go that far?" She turned to look at Raven and returned her gaze to Northern's retreating back. He's weak-willed. He has so much potential but is shielding himself from something. People like him are the ones I hate most. But it's quite understandable. I have seen people break apart mentally from the things that have happened in this desolation. It got to a point where even I wasn't able to really keep it together. But what distinguishes us from others is that we embrace our fears. To be courageous does not mean we don't have any fears. It just means we stand on our feet, legs shaking, spirit cowering but will unbroken. Her gaze on Northern deepened. This guy here is the worst. There's no strength in acting like you don't have any fears, pretending to be logical when everything you do reeks of fear. It's annoying. She turned her head and spat in irritation. Raven's eyes stayed on her for a while, then she nodded. Looks like he is determined to go nonetheless. Shall we move? Helena shrugged. Don't blame me if he gets killed. Raven scoffed. He won't. With that, the group began their journey, with Northern walking a bit apart from the others, silent and just moving. The path they had to traverse for now wasn't difficult but at least sandy and somewhat strenuous to walk, so they grew quite tired in a couple of hours into their journey. Plus, the daylight in the Sloria territory seemed to be harsher for some reason. The journey was almost frustrating because the closer they walked to the tower, the farther it seemed from them. And it was important to pass it because it was supposed to mark the entrance to the mountains. The group silently walked forward, except at intervals where Raven and Terence seemed to be in conversation. Other times, it was Helena and Terence. The feral sage sometimes almost looked like she was admiring a priceless jewel in the way she doted on the tender oracle. She and Raven did not speak much, but there were times where they exchanged a word or two out of necessity. Northern just stayed to the side, proceeding with a gloomy air around him. He was angry but also at this point being objective with himself. The things Helena said, were they really true? He did face hell. Yes. His mind was enslaved. Yes. And that much of a harrowing experience must have left him with severe mental trauma. That wouldn't have been out of the ordinary. Even though he was old enough not to be Northern. No, Elliot had never had this kind of harrowing experience before. He was solely a pampered child until the moment he died. It was difficult to place high expectations on himself because, in truth, many kids originally from Trael were far more resilient than he was. Take Raven for example, she definitely had stronger mental fortitude than he did. And yet he claimed to be far older than she was in terms of the mind. But both of them had grown up in completely different environments. Of course, Northern didn't know about Raven's upbringing. But at the least, he knew that his own was full of love, just like his old life before his parents passed away in an accident when he was in university. He had all the love he needed, saw himself so much as a child that it was a little hard to see himself as an adult. He became naive in a way. Northern gritted his teeth even harder. I wasn't naive. It was just. As he made that excuse, he felt his arrogance soar higher. He was being sincere with himself at the very least right now. Was he really that scared of dying? And if he was, who wouldn't be? None of them had to survive by munching on red crystals. There are no red crystals to save his butt right now. And yet he, of all people, knew that there are greater threats than even night terror out there. What was so bad with the idea of getting stronger in the Central Plains? Are there not drifters? Take, for example, the few paragons notable in the Central Plains. Did they have to come to the continent of Stelia, to this desolation, to be as strong as they are? And so what rule said that one needed a place like this to get strong? As much as Northern wanted to accept that notion, Helena's words bothered him more and more. Would Ruffsburg really just let him live should he get to the Central Plains? To make the whole thing worse, he had a special case where he found himself in a rift different from others. It was possible that Ruffsburg could have intentionally meant for him to be killed. Northern couldn't find a reason as to why the principal would want him dead. But he was a crazy bastard who sent hundreds of innocent students to the middle of a desolate place rigged with monsters. For what? Because the hardest steels are forged in the hottest furnace? Damn it! It was just a lunatic idea, one that a man with any semblance of humanity shouldn't have. Ruffsburg, that guy, deserved no mercy. Even death, at this point, would be letting him off the hook too easily. And right now, Northern hated to admit it, but he wasn't confident of defeating a paragon. No, not even a master. Which was why there was a need to get stronger, to become more adept with his range of abilities. But that did not mean he accepted everything Helena said. Tsh, judging me like she knows a damn thing. None of them knew anything about him or what he had to face. So, at this point, why should he care about what they thought of him? He didn't ask anyone to place expectations on him, and he had no obligation to meet their judgments. But at the same time, he was open to constructive criticism of himself. At least he felt he was.
Chapter 253. Strsi na fog.
The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the group of 3 ladies and 1 man, with the man walking a few meters behind them. Its unforgiving rays seared their skin and left them drenched in sweat. Each step they took became a struggle, the blistering heat sapping their strength and making the air feel heavy and suffocating. Their throats were parched, lips cracked and dry from the relentless dehydration. The ground beneath their boots was scorching to the touch, the sand so hot it felt like walking on burning coals. The blinding glare of the sun forced the brunette-haired lady among them to squint, reducing her vision to a narrow slit of clarity, ensuring they were heading the correct path. The boy trudged slowly behind them, a dark aura around him. His soft linen clung uncomfortably to his body, soaked with sweat and gritty with sand, while his pale, exposed skin had reddened. Breathing itself became a chore, each inhale bringing in air that felt like it had been heated in a forge. But still, he continued silently. They continued silently. As they walked forward, the blazing of the sun did not show any mercy. If anything, it seemed to be particularly merciless today, fiercely casting a relentless heat over the vast expanse of sand. The air shimmered, distorting the landscape with mirage-like illusions. Amidst the rolling dunes, a tangled mass of bleached bones jutted out, their twisted forms hinting at the presence of some malevolent evils at one time. The brunette lady paused when she came by the first one, narrowing her eyes and looking around with her hand above her eyes. "What is it?" the dark-haired lady with burning crimson eyes asked her. "We are getting closer." The wind at this point was stronger, carrying with it waves of sand that shrouded their path forward like a fog. It was a fog of sand, and it was incredibly difficult to look ahead. However, she continued to lead them, even into the fog of sand. After a few more steps, they began to come across more and more of these buried bones. And after a while, they finally emerged from the fog of sand, revealing a compelling and intimidating landscape. Enormous ribcages arched skyward, and skulls with jagged, uneven teeth lay half-buried, partially obscured by the shifting sands. Each bone, eroded and weathered by time, told silent tales of battles long past and monstrous beings that once roamed this desolate place. Rising from this skeletal graveyard was a towering structure, a monolith forged from the very sand it dominated. The tower's surface was rough and uneven, with grains of sand perpetually trickling down its sides as if time itself was eroding its foundations. Ancient symbols, barely discernible and worn smooth by countless years, adorned its base, whispering secrets of forgotten eras. Cracks and crevices marred its facade, giving it a decrepit appearance, as though it might crumble at any moment. Yet, there was an undeniable aura of mystery about it, a testament to an age long gone, standing as a solitary sentinel amidst the sea of sand and bones. Helena looked up at the solitary sentinel for a few seconds. She then looked around. Raven observed her for a couple of minutes and asked, "You've seemed somewhat cautious since we entered the sand fog. Is something wrong?" Helena lingered for a moment, then replied, "You see, little worm, the thing is..." She looked back. Northern was just emerging from the sand fog. "There's not supposed to be a fog." Raven narrowed her eyes. "What does that mean?" "I'm not sure. But it can't be. There's going to be a sandstorm. If we continue, we might get caught up in it at night and not survive." Terence interrupted Helena. Both Helena and Raven looked at her. Their eyes slightly widened. "A sandstorm?" Terence nodded. "I'm not sure what it is, but I think it's the cyclical passing of a strange creature. The fog is an indication. How can I explain this? What I can say is, it's a creature as dangerous as the Kirathon, but it cycles around a certain circumference in this area." Helena blinked. "I'm not sure what you mean, but I guess that means we can't continue further right now." Raven stared at her intently. Then she also asked, "Was this where you came to the other time?" Terence shook her head. "Not exactly, but the signs are the same." Helena folded her arms, thinking to herself for a while. She threw her eyes briefly over Terence to see Northern, who was still behind them, but instead of heading towards them, he was heading towards the tower. She raised a brow. "What is that silly flower boy doing?" Terence and Raven turned their heads to look. "I guess he's going to the tower?" Terence said. "Yes." "Why?" A frown creased Helena's brows after she asked the question. "Maybe he knows too, that there'll be a sandstorm." Terence sighed. "Whatever the case, I don't think we should be going to the tower." Helena returned her gaze to Terence. Inquisitive. "Why?" she asked. "I'm not gonna lie, I was even considering it. I mean, it looks like our best bet at hiding from the sandstorm." Terence shook her head, flapping her hair softly. "That tower is an anomaly due to the rift. It didn't exist 30 years ago. I've always seen it here though. That is because it appeared a few months after the 4 cardinal rifts suddenly broke out." The revelation took Helena by surprise. She frowned seriously. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Raven thought for a while and chimed in. "I've never heard of such a thing happening." Terence allowed a slight frown on her brows as she responded to them. "I too have never experienced anything like it. There's this strange sense of warning not to enter there. Like I just feel we shouldn't be in that place. Perhaps it would pose an even greater threat than the sandstorm." She hesitated, then added, "Moreover, I don't think it will open its door to us. Many have tried to enter. No one has ever entered." Helena blinked rapidly, stuttering, I think Flower Boy just entered." Chapter 254, Ull's Warning. Terence turned. Her head slightly tilted and her eyes widened. "Huh? How?" "Strikes me too," Helena commented. Raven was also staring at the entrance of the tower, which Northern had just gone through. She slowly pointed towards it and asked, "So, are we going?" Terence shuddered for a second. "It's dangerous," she muttered, seeming to shrink away in fear. "At the same time, we can't stay outside." "Terence, what's wrong?" Raven asked directly, her crimson gaze boring into the tender oracle's eyes. Terence was silent for a few seconds, unable to pinpoint exactly what was happening, but also couldn't deny the strong feeling of warning from Ull. To be precise, she lived by reading directions of essence, apart from her special abilities. This was how her perception of things functioned at the highest level. She could read the essence of things, of course, in a different manner than how Northern could. Because of her overwhelming soul essence, she felt connected to the voice of Ull stronger than normal drifters did. It was also because of this overwhelming soul essence that allowed her to pinpoint the direction of other essences, down to the minuscule essence in the air. Northern, on the other hand, had eyes that could see it. However, none of them knew that. So, Northern's action was very strange to them, one that demanded an answer. Plus, they'd been walking for quite a while. No one was saying it, but the thought of going to rest in the tower was somewhat blissful. Helena sighed. Perhaps we would have to disobey Ul? Terence's face contorted into a scary grimace immediately after Helena spoke, almost making the feral sage shrink back in intimidation. Raven, however, stepped in front of her view and said to her face, "There is no other option for us, Terence. You said it yourself, a sandstorm is coming. If that is the case, walking to the mountains is a death call. I don't know how Northern was able to do it, but he opened that tower, so we have shelter in the end." Terence only grimaced more and turned her head away from the two of them. "You can go. I am not going to disobey Ul." Raven frowned. "Are you serious?" "Yes." She stood her ground. The frown on Raven's face deepened fiercely. The gentle-looking lady turned swiftly, her black tresses swaying in the air, and she walked away towards the tower, calling Helena with her. "Let's go." Helena exchanged glances between Raven and Terence. Seriously, what is going on in this group? No one would have ever thought it was possible for Terence and Raven to disagree with one another. For a fact, Terence was practically Raven's fangirl. So whatever hold Ul had on the tender oracle was quite strong. It made Helena really wonder what exactly was going on. She couldn't just leave this young girl outside. At least that was what Terence looked like to her. Raven, after reaching halfway, turned back and called, "What are you doing? Let's go." Helena stared at her, blinking unbelievably. She had always known Raven had a streak of cruelty crawling somewhere in her web of personalities. But she was still caught by an unbelievable surprise. Priestess, one that in any other country would almost be worshipped, would be placed in a temple and given all rights of protection and reverence. It was someone like that Raven was treating this way. Couldn't she have at least persuaded her more? Shown she cared. But then, the best Raven could try was, "Are you serious?" And now, all of this was beginning to create a tough situation for the feral sage, who was by all rights the head of the group. At least supposedly. "What are you going to do about the storm?" "I will survive it somehow." Terence wore a very dark grimace. It made a semblance of maturity squeeze out of her childlike face. "Cute!" Helena chuckled inwardly. She sighed and looked at the tower. Raven was closer to it and wasn't even looking back. "I don't know what to do. I might just leave you alone." "It is fine, Lady Helena, I will." "But—" Helena's hand moved swiftly like a blur, and struck her neck. The tender oracle slumped into her arms without even getting to finish her statement. "I apologize." With that, she placed Terence over her shoulders and walked to the tower. After a while, she too was inside the tower. As she entered, she slowly dropped the oracle beside the wall by the entrance and gazed in wonder at the spectacle that was unveiled before her eyes. The moment she stepped into the tower, the world outside seemed to vanish, swallowed by an all-encompassing darkness. The air inside was cool, a stark contrast to the blazing heat of the desert. Faint glimmers of light filtered through narrow slits in the walls, casting eerie, dancing shadows across the vast chamber. Intricate mosaics adorned the floor, each tiny piece of stone forming elaborate patterns that seemed to shift and change with every glance, as if alive with a magic of their own. The walls were carved with ancient symbols, their meanings lost to time and mystery, but their presence imposing. In the dim, spiral staircases of impossibly smooth stone wound upwards, seemingly unsupported and defying the laws of gravity. Helena couldn't help but open her mouth in amazement. "I'm speechless." Raven looked around, though subtle. Those sparks of surprise danced in her crimson eyes. "I was too," she commented. Northern was standing close to the wall, his gaze tightly locked on the symbols that marked the wall. Staring at him from behind, Helena leaned towards Raven and asked, "What's with him?" She shrugged in response, saying, "He's been like that since I came here." Helena nodded slowly. "I see." She turned to look at the unconscious oracle. "You should have just left her," Raven said. "She'll learn when she almost loses her life." Shocked by her statement, Helena couldn't help but open her mouth with a pale expression. What? Geez. I have so much pity for your friends. I don't have friends. Yeah. I can see why. Chapter 255. Call of the Tower, Part 1. It was a lot to take in all at once. But being called by a freaking tower was the top of it all. A few minutes ago, while the ladies trekked in front, Northern moved slowly behind them. The thickness of the sand fog was blinding, but not exactly for him. Perhaps that just meant he was getting to discover more things about his eyes than he thought. And after what had happened while he was extensively using chaos, he could see better. His vision was sharper and more accurate. It was like it went 10 times better than it used to be. His scope of vision went farther and wider. The ratio to which he could also process the information seen also skyrocketed. And not only that, now, it seemed he could even see 360 degrees. Surely it was a strange phenomenon. But Northern was sure about what he felt. He didn't need to turn his head to look at his back. What he knew was that, at a point while deliberating using the unseeing eyes to guide himself, and he wanted to check back. Instead of instinctively looking back, his polychoria eyes moved, dividing 2 eyeballs to function each on their own in each eye. The 2 of them moved towards the corner of his eyes, towards his ears, and expanded his vision more than he expected. It was like both of his vision on both eyes turned around to converge right in the back of his head, without even needing to turn his head. Not only that, Northern tried a few things as he walked. Not only could he just see, he could divide his eyes into 4 compartments views to see 4 different things at the same time. It was a lot to take in, especially the processing of information, proved tasking on his brain, but he was sure that with time, if he made a meaningful use of this new ability, this wouldn't rather be a problem. The amazing and strange changes in his eyes, however, caused him to check their information again on his profile. Name: Northern Longguard. True name: nameless. Attributes: formless, spawn of void, limitless void, vestige of chaos and void, chaos eyes, chaos thread, flames of chaos. Soul rank: drifter. Void summons: 1/100. Talent fragments: 288/2000. Copied talents: 1/2. Own talents: 1. Attribute abilities: active/passive. September 10th. Owned items: Mortal Blade, Eternal Twilight, Silver Sword, Death Glare, and 5 others. Void summons: 1/100. Name: Chaos Eyes. Rank: Abyssal. Description: your eyes have peered into the ligatures of chaos, you have seen their structures, your hands have handed and weaved them in your interest. Starting with your eyes, your entirety is beginning to conform to the will of chaos. You harbor darkness and destruction. More information. All passive and active abilities have been seared into the essence of the eyes. They are the foundation on which Chaos Eyes operate and are not worthy enough to be singularized as an ability of their own. Continue to tread the path of chaos and perhaps your bond with darkness and destruction would open a truly worthy ability of Chaos Eyes for you. Somehow Northern couldn't tell if this was a good thing or a bad thing. At least with the description he saw, he could tell that something had happened to his eyes and perhaps a good thing to boot. However, the extra note sounded more like an insult than extra information. He sighed and dismissed the panel. At least now he knew his eyes were better. And so, to check if truly something had happened to the unseeing eyes, Northern needed to once again use it in particular. However, what unveiled before his vision was something entirely different. They were streams of blue, but instead of like thread-like weaves, they carried an orange-like hue within their depth and were like those ligatures. Only that now, there was no darkness, it was like they were flowing in this reality, sparkling with a blue and orange glow and casting forth an ethereal beauty before Northern's eyes. Each ligature was like a burning line, on a blurring race to its source, with a caricature of colors that beautified his surroundings in a radiance of azure and coral. And then suddenly, a particular line of ligature singled out, flowing in a darkish purple stream, very distinct from the rest. Even though the fog shrouded his sight, he could make out the source of the stream. His eyes zoomed in on it with little to no effort, causing his pupils to magnificently dilate. And there it was, the entrance of the tower. The purple stream of ligature was coming from the tower, and silently beckoning on him, blinking brightly and dimming again with a subtle but disturbing humming sound. Northern curiously followed it, till he walked out of the fog and ended at the entrance of the tower. The tower's door. There didn't look like there was a door there at all. It didn't look like there was an entrance. But following this particular stream of ligature, it was coming directly from within the tower. Something was definitely there that was somehow related to it. Not to say, there was this disturbing feeling in his soul. Northern couldn't pinpoint what it was exactly, but he also couldn't disregard it. So by all costs, he just had to see what it was that was beckoning unto him. Then his hand slowly scurried along the surface of the tower, slowly tracing towards that point where the ligature entered directly. And when it got to that point, Northern felt a vast amount of void essence sap out of him before he could even stop it from happening. It was like something just sucked them out. He was still worried when he began to hear an eerie creak. Slowly, a line split the wall of the tower from that point he had touched and formed a rectangular frame out, breaking forth dust and sand, as if the doors of the tower were being crafted in that very moment. And slowly it opened up to Northern. Curious and inquisitive of what exactly this was, Northern took slow and steady steps into the darkness of the tower. Chapter 256. Call of the Tower, Part 2. Northern walked into the tower, admiring its remarkable structure. The interior was chilly, welcoming him into a cool embrace that served as a sanctuary from the searing heat he was enduring outside. But it was more than that. Every corner, every element that made up this sentinel, exuded the craftsmanship of a being that has far transcended the limitations of mortality. Northern couldn't help but envision this as the handiwork of some kind of transcendent entity. But that was not what caught his attention or amazed him the most. There were intricately carved texts of some sort on the walls, crowding every nook like the inscriptions of a brilliant mind. Something about this place made him remember the ruin he and Night Terror had stumbled upon in the mountain. Something about it felt so familiar, and he couldn't help but be drawn to it. So he walked forward with his eyes fixated on them. When Northern stopped in front of the wall, directly opposite the main entrance, which also marked the point where the spiraling smooth stairs began, he took a deep breath and keenly examined what he saw. At first glance, they looked puzzling. Northern was certain that this was a type of runic script that was not studied in trial. After all, he was quite the writer and had studied 3 different languages, including symbolic representation and runic scripts. Although they had slight strokes here and there that could hint at a striking resemblance to Trial's runic writing style. But they were essentially different, in fact, vastly different from each other. The problem, however, was he could understand it. And the only scenario where he reckoned this could happen was when he could speak the monster language without ever learning or hearing it before. And now, he could comprehend these runic scripts, when he had never even seen them before. He could read them as if he were reading normal runic letters. He was almost deluded into thinking he was mistaken, that this could just be the runic script he was accustomed to in Trial. But no, Northern was sure. The strokes were too different to be it. It definitely didn't belong to Trial. However, he was beginning to consider the possibility that it could belong to another civilization. Else, it would have been impossible for the basis of both runic languages to be common. It made no sense. Northern flipped his white bangs and placed his hand tiredly on his forehead. He paused for a while. That was when Raven entered. However, he didn't need to look back to know it was Raven. All he had to do was unfocus his eyeballs on one eye and glance sideways to see. And then he focused on what he was reading. The texts were random, so it was tough to piece them together. Hence, Northern figured he needed to find the beginning of them. He paused and stood silently, thinking deeply about why he could understand these things. Why could he speak to a monster and converse like one? Something had to be at play in this situation. Something had to be involved. And honestly, he could think of a limited number of what it could be, and one of them stood out quite differently. The strange man in the beginning. Northern sighed and shook his head. Let's move past that for now. Yes. He had to focus on what was in front of him. He had to figure out the present. So he was going to trace it from the beginning. That was when Helena entered and dropped Terence beside the entrance. Of course, Northern didn't have to turn his head as usual. His face grimaced with irritation as she entered. Her words rang in his head again. In all honesty, people like her had to be the kind of people he hated the most. People who don't mind their own business and think they are some tarot card readers that can tell one's past, present, and future just by picking a few cards and reading the lines on their hand. Utterly vexing. He seethed inwardly. As much as she irritated him so much, he couldn't fight against her. Even if he did, to what end was it? She might be a sage, but he was sure he had ways to defeat her. Yes, he was getting somewhat confident in himself, albeit out of spite and arrogance. He could use his true name ability to render her nameless. But he didn't want to do that. It really served no purpose. He would just focus on a way to move forward on his own. If it demanded that he travels differently from the cohort, then at this point he didn't mind. Ignoring the two ladies that seemed to be whispering something to each other, Northern walked back to the entrance, glanced down at the unconscious Terence, and continued to inspect the texts. He shook his head. No, this is not it. Then he walked forward again. He was about to take his first step up the stairs when Raven's voice resounded in the darkness. Northern, she called, albeit softly. Northern paused and looked at her. Maybe for them seeing in the darkness was a bit too much, especially Raven's case, but not for him. She took a couple of steps forward and stopped about 3 feet away from him. She didn't seem to be struggling with the darkness, at least not that much. Northern responded with an irritated tone. What? How? Did you open the door to this place? This is supposed to be a tower that no one has ever entered. Not to mention, it's a creation of the rift. Northern withdrew his step from the first stair and turned to her, frowning a little. What do you mean it's a creation of the rift? What rift? He inquired. Helena joined the conversation. We are not sure. But the priestess said the tower didn't used to be here and only appeared a couple of months after the rift broke out. Northern's frown deepened. What they were saying was beginning to sound nonsensical. So you're saying the tower was not there, and voila, the tower is there now. Helena grimaced at him but exhaled and responded. I don't know what voila means, but if you mean by how absurdly true this is, then yes. The tower was not here before, and voila, it is now. Chapter 257. Call of the Tower, Part 3. Northern's irritation toward the feral sage seemed to soar over the top the more she spoke. She acted in a way that just infuriated him from every angle. To think he had admired someone like her and thought her awesome. He couldn't help but be disappointed in his own taste. Raven's voice interrupted the eerie silence. So, can you please tell us exactly what happened? Northern was silent for a while, full of skepticism. In that interim, Helena was already getting a little impatient, tapping her feet on the floor annoyingly and glaring at Northern. It was nothing childish, just that he disgusted her. All of her. Finally, Northern opened his mouth and gave a response. There's not much to explain, other than the tower summoned me. Not much to explain. However, this statement of his caused the eyes of both ladies to widen. What do you mean, Northern? Raven inquired to ensure she heard correctly what he just said. It is as I said it. The tower called me, he continued further. When I got here, there was no door. After touching it, however, a door appeared and opened. He looked around and concluded, I think there's something in this place that resonates with something in my soul. Just how special does the lame guy have to be? Helena muttered but could be heard clearly. Northern glared at her and looked away. After a few seconds, his voice rang out. Right now, I'm trying to study the symbols on the wall for any clues. But I think I'll have to find where it originated. Ha! Raven and Helena's voices came out simultaneously. Both of them looked at each other with a dazed expression and then turned their eyes to Northern. You can decipher this gibberish? Helena retorted. What Helena meant was, how is it that you can understand these? I thought they were just symbols. Even if they do hold significant meaning, shouldn't it be significant to the world in the rift and not this world? Northern was silent. Not that he was hesitating. Before opening his mouth to speak, he had considered how much information about himself he was willing to divulge, and had even pondered as far as what to answer should there be any questions that aimed to delve further into revealing his abilities. Not that he intentionally wanted to hide them, but at the same time he didn't want to disclose them all, at least not intentionally. Taking his precious time, he finally responded. Well, they are not quite difficult to comprehend. The strokes are quite similar to ours, and if you know your runic letters like the back of your hand, it will be easy for you to interpret the symbols into text. Raven's eyes grew somber as she said, I see. You make it sound so effortless. Northern threw a quick glance at the feral sage. He was still angry at her, but he ignored it and answered her. Well, it would be so effortless if you were actually serious about basic understanding of languages. Helena shrugged. Then blame my parents for not having enough to get me a tutor or send me to one of those basic schools. Northern's frown did not soften. He just looked away and turned. Not even pity was going to end the spite between them. He said as he walked away. I intend to inspect it from the highest floor. I'm sure I'll find something. He suddenly paused and turned, brows heavy with a scowl. Can I ask why you came here? His eyes drifted toward the unconscious Terence. And why your companion is unconscious? There's going to be a sandstorm. We were trying to avoid it by coming here. Terence, however, refused to come because Ul asked her not to. So Helena knocked her out and brought her here. Is that so? Northern's eyes drifted from the unconscious oracle to the feral sage, who frowned slightly. His patience was reaching its peak. He might lash out without caring about the consequences. Northern averted his eyes from her and started walking up the stairs. Each step he took echoed in the cavernous space, a sound that reverberated with an ominous, almost sentient quality. As he ascended, the air grew thicker, charged with a palpable sense of mystery and power. Higher up, vast rooms opened up, filled with strange, dark mechanisms. Gears the size of houses turned silently, their surfaces etched with cryptic runes. These mechanisms moved with a precise, almost hypnotic rhythm, suggesting a purpose beyond mortal comprehension. Chains of an unidentifiable metal dangled from the high ceilings, swaying gently as if touched by an unseen hand. Bridges of delicate-looking glass connected the higher floors, spanning dizzying gaps and offering views of the tower's internal workings far below. As Northern walked across them, he felt like he was stepping into the void, the translucent material giving a vertiginous sense of floating in midair. The walls of these upper levels were lined with shelves holding ancient texts, their pages filled with dense, spidery script and elaborate illustrations. The books seemed to hum with knowledge, their presence almost sentient, as if aware of the secrets they held. In the highest chamber, a vast dome arched overhead, its surface a tapestry of dark, glittering constellations. At the center stood a grand, imposing mechanism, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its purpose as enigmatic as the tower itself. This chamber exuded a profound stillness, a sense of reverence that inspired awe and fear in equal measure. Northern cautiously walked toward the center and paused. The mechanism, whatever it was, dominated the space like a dormant titan. Its base was a vast, circular platform, forged from an unknown metal that shimmered with a dark, almost liquid brilliance. Around the edges, intricate engravings spiraled inward, converging at the center where a massive, crystal socket lay empty, the broken remnants of its former power source scattered around it like shards of a fallen star. The mechanism's core was an elaborate array of gears, wheels, and cogs, all interlocking with a precision that defied human craftsmanship. Some gears were as large as a man, while others were delicately small, yet each of them radiated a silent, almost reverent grace. This dormant machinery hinted at a purpose far beyond ordinary comprehension, its design both beautiful and fearsome in its complexity. Northern could discern at a glance that this was the center, this was the core of the tower. And whatever this mechanism was his clue to uncovering the beginning of all of this. From the central platform, a network of metallic arms extended outward, their joints and pivots gleaming in the faint light. These arms connected to a series of concentric rings that surrounded the platform, each ring adorned with more of the enigmatic runes he had seen throughout the tower. The rings were designed to rotate independently, their motion governed by the intricate dance of the mechanism's gears and cogs. High above, suspended from the dome by thick, braided cables, hung a series of massive, multifaceted lenses. These lenses, darkened by age and coated in a thin layer of dust, were positioned to focus and direct light or energy into the crystal socket below. Northern lingered for a few moments, studying and trying to trace in his mind how the lenses guided the rays of light toward the center of this marvelous contraption where an empty crystal socket sat. The walls around the mechanism were lined with panels of ancient script and diagrams, so after doing that, he quickly moved and began to observe each text, each diagram. It took a while for Northern to grasp, but the moment he did, he paused, took a couple of steps back with his mouth open, and, trembling, his voice muttered, "The tower can move?" Chapter 258. Call of the Tower, Part 4. The scripts and diagrams on the wall described the process of activating the mechanism, channeling the crystal's energy through the gears and rings, setting the entire tower in motion. The engravings pulsed with a residual energy, as if the tower itself mourned the loss of its life force, the shattered crystal. This mechanism, though now silent and inert, exuded a sense of latent power and dark majesty. It stood as a testament to an advanced and mysterious civilization, its craftsmanship both a marvel and an enigma, promising untold potential if only its source of energy could be restored. And Northern now stood as the first sentient being to ever unravel those true meanings since the tower's appearance. If the tower could really move, then it was no mystery how they suddenly found it in this land after the rifts started appearing. But this would mean that the tower, at that time, had a pilot. It was highly improbable that the tower had just happened to move on its own. With the core of the gear, the crystal, broken, Northern suspected that something significant must have occurred here. He admired the gear for a couple more seconds, wishing he could truly control the tower's mechanism and move it. There'd be absolutely no need for him to search for some damn flying ship. He took the shards of crystal. They were gray and lusterless, seeming lifeless. Then he used soul eyes on it. Item. Name. Viri. Type. Utility. Rank. Unknown. Description. This crystal is cut out from the tree of Ayuva's citadel. That's all. That's all. Northern turned his eyes around, taking in the magnanimous entirety of the room. The tower could move, he knew that, but right now it was probably impossible to make it move. Except one way was to cut out another crystal from this tree in Ayuva's citadel. Where is Ayuva's citadel? Who is Ayuva? And how the hell could a crystal be cut out of a tree? Northern had many questions but for now, decided that he would put them on hold. After the description for the operation of the mechanism for the tower's motion, started a complex but amazing storytelling. One that Northern had been searching for all the while. Right at the entrance of the topmost room was where it started. It was a personal chronicle. One that the owner of the tower must have carved. The purpose for now was still unknown. However, Northern began to read. The scripts were arranged vertically from top to bottom, so he had to crane his neck for a little while. For someone with ordinary eyesight, even if they could understand the language, reading it that far up was impossible. But it wasn't for Northern, who now had chaos eyes. He could discern every letter, carefully reading along. It took time, but Northern was oblivious to the passage of time. His legs moved slowly as his reading progressed. At some point, a loud thunderstorm resounded outside the tower, one that caused an incandescent reflection of light to blink. But it quickly disappeared, chased away by the calm and peaceful darkness of this sentinel tower. Northern, meanwhile, was not even aware of all this. He just continued to read. Sometimes, his expression would pale. Sometimes he would narrow his eyes to slits. Other times his eyes would widen with realization. There were even times when he chuckled. A couple of hours later, the entire tower began to tremble heavily, but Northern was not concerned. Raven. who was buried in a pile of books, immediately shot her head up to discern what was going on. She paused for a minute since the trembling seemed to have stopped. And as she returned to her reading, it happened again. She rose to her feet and walked out of the room she was in, crossing the bridge to the stairs and winding down to go to another bridge that now connected to the lower room before hers. Where Helena was, the feral sage, just like her too, was standing before a shelf of books, one particularly in her hand, her eyes briskly scanning its text. She raised her head to look at Raven, who entered with her usual gentle composure. "I think it's the sandstorm," Helena said, knowing very well the reason why Raven was here. "I see. But how powerful is the sandstorm for it to make the tower tremble?" Helena put her finger in between the pages she was reading and lowered the book, giving Raven all her attention. "The driving force of that sandstorm is a monster. Don't be shocked. It's that powerful, enough to make a massive tower like this one tremble." Both of them were silent for a while. Then Helena inquired, "What about Flower Boy? I'm shocked as to how engrossed he is in those symbols. He didn't even flinch when I came close to him. Right now, he's on the 3rd floor." Helena looked down for a moment. 7 more floors to go, huh? "Why?" Raven asked. "Obviously, because we need to share information. Somehow, I have a feeling that whatever is on those walls are the most important thing in this tower. There's a lot of strange things happening here, but I believe your Flower Boy must be a crucial key to unlocking it." "Aren't you placing too many expectations on him?" Raven asked with one raised brow. Helena shrugged with both shoulders. "I'm not the one that can read texts, but I no expectations of any sort. All we need is information to get what we are looking for." Raven looked away for a second. There was no record of the Lord of Lotherlywan entering the tower. "He probably didn't," Helena added. Raven looked outside. "Which makes Northern the first?" "Exactly. Makes him quite special, doesn't it? If only he would actually prove to be more." Raven turned back to her, but with a deep frown. Her frown caused Helena to inquire arrogantly, "What? Don't do that." Fiercely Raven intoned. "Don't do what? Don't project your thoughts on him like that. He is what he is and will be what he will be. You are not the moral compass of this group." Helena raised her chin a bit. "It's cute seeing you take his side like that."
Moral campes.
She scoffed. "I wouldn't even dream of being such a wretched thing. I just want to get this over with and leave this land as a victor, not a runner." Once more the tower trembled. Chapter 259. The Burden of Faith, Part 1. The sandstorm continued, shaking every inch of the tower powerfully, but the sentinels stood strong, unfazed, withstanding the mighty force that was crashing against it. Terence sat cross-legged at the base of the tower where she woke up, a deep frown etched on her face, and her eyes were closed, while Helena and Raven continued to read whatever they could, going from room to room. The sandstorm, with deafening roars of thunder, or so it seemed, continued, and Northern's focus did not waver through it all. The white-haired kid continued to study the scripts on the wall, flavored by different moods at different times. But alas, he was finally back at the 10th floor, which served as the base of the tower. He continued to read until he got to the entrance, around where Terence was seated. Despite being near her, the oracle did not open her eyes. Instead, she just shifted a little so Northern could have his way with whatever they were doing. The doors of the tower had long been closed, and everything was shrouded in an encroaching darkness. At a time, the subtle glow that was seeping in from slight cracks all disappeared, hinting at the presence of the night. There were a few glows in the darkness, some certain symbols and Northern's azure eyes. He finally paused as he looked down and shivered with a pale face. What? The last path is missing? Or rather, he didn't get to finish it? There was a start of a statement connoted by a single stroke, but it seemed like the writer had hesitated at the last minute and decided not to write down the most important thing in his chronicle. Northern couldn't help but be so angry. It was a lot of suspense. He grimaced at the texts and fell back, landing on his butt and leaning on his hand. "Damn, I'm tired," he muttered to himself. He had probably been standing for over 6 hours and wasn't even self-aware because of how absorbed he was in the script. It made him remember days where he would study for exams and read 12 hours straight with 20-minute breaks every 3 hours. Those were days when he truly enjoyed himself. Maybe I should consider becoming a scholar. That way I'd have access to a lot of books and spend most of my time reading. Northern was book-smart. He knew how to comprehend hard subjects and had a knack for accurate and precise mathematical problem-solving abilities. Also, in collaboration with, to an extent, a retentive memory. But there was a vast difference between book-smart and street-smart. While being book-smart was commendable, it didn't earn one survival in the harsh society, not of earth, not of trial. And that's why Northern had lost on Earth before. Yet, he was making the same mistake, slowly heading towards his loss in this world too. But this time was different. At the very least, he was being objective and ascertaining himself. And surrounded by, well, people who spoke the truth, even though he didn't trust them. After a while, everywhere became silent, in a way deafening too. Northern laid on the ground, his eyes closed, ruminating on all that he had read just now. "Are you that happy?" Terence's voice interrupted his thoughts. He opened his eyes and raised his head to look at the oracle. Her eyes were still closed. "Happiness is not the word. It's just exciting." "I see." Her voice simmered down after that. Silence ensued for a couple more seconds before Northern's voice came forth. "You seem angry." "That's because I am." Her response and tone were as sharp as a dagger's edge. "Why?" "All warned me not to come. But at the same time, they said you gave the warning of a sandstorm." He tried to be cautious with his tone and the words he used. "I know." The girl's frown seemed to soften a little. "I wish I had an answer too. But I am a vessel that houses favor from all. If her voice comes today and asks me to die, then I have no choice, Northern."
I will gladly die.
Her life must suck. Northern couldn't imagine himself dying because someone else deemed it so. Not in this life, not ever. Which was one of the reasons he detested religion. Fanatics who took to the extreme commandments of beings painted by legends and myths. But on the other hand, all was real. The origins were, and the tyrants too. But something bothered him. Cautiously, he looked at Terence and opened his mouth. "Terence, I have a question." The oracle turned her head to him and smiled, without opening her eyes. "This is the first time you have called my name." Northern wore a face of slight shock. He didn't even notice. "You can ask your question." His gaze became a little more serious than before. Do you think she is an origin, tyrant, or a god?" Terence was silent for a while. She hesitated but spoke, firstly saying, "I'm not sure what you mean by god." "Right. She doesn't understand what a god is." There were some words that, in the common language of trial, were untranslated. Northern had by his own self put the words together from his knowledge of alphabets, but yet no one understood it, simply because it didn't exist. It had happened with his parents again, and Northern had tried to be careful, but this time it just spilled because those were his thoughts in actuality. He was beginning to consider the chances of Ul being an actual god, or in this case, goddess. Terence breathed and said, "I'm not sure myself. After knowing about the history of the rifts, the existence of the tyrants and the origins, I have asked myself so many controversial questions about Ul. The knowledge that was passed down to me goes as thus. Ul is a convolution of stars, the line that connects one constellation to another. And you know what constellations are, right? A bodification of souls, to put it in a way, they were the first materialization to ever exist, and Ul is considered their mother and the mother of the world." Chapter 260. The Burden of Faith, Part 2. In Trael, the months are named after each one of these constellations to honor them. They weren't particularly gods. In fact, in no history have they ever been noted taking action on their own. In a sense, they were almost non-existent. But the core of their importance to the world, especially to drifters, was that when one became a sage, their soul took on a personality, and it was usually one of these 12 constellations. That did not mean one's soul conformed entirely to the embodiment of that constellation. It just meant that the said constellation served as a foundation for their soul's personality and much more, their stellar body when they became paragons. Terence nodded to what Northern said and responded. As a vessel of all, I was taught by my mother not to have any shred of doubt, as it could turn out to be a very dangerous weapon sharpened against my own self. Even if all is wrong, then I am wrong. Such is my fate. She paused for a heartbeat and continued. I am not granted the freedom and liberty to choose when it comes to all. And I am content with that life. I didn't choose it, and I most certainly don't want to end it. Northern sighed. Is it difficult? Being a vessel of an overwhelming amount of soul essence. So overwhelming that I can accurately discern that of others? Well, it surely is difficult, but I think sometimes the benefits outweigh the difficulties. She stopped but remembered something. Then again came her voice. Since we are on the topic of soul essence, do you know that you do not have a soul essence, you do not have a soul core too? A slight frown furrowed on Northern's brows. I can feel you getting angry. I suppose you have told Raven about that? No, I haven't. I only tell Raven what she asks, what is for her good, and what I'm sure of. Your situation, however, causes me to be so confused. You have no soul core and soul essence, but yet I can read a certain essence from you. The voice of all in your soul is very low, almost as if it's being suppressed by something else. Thanks. While I do appreciate the analysis about me, it's getting quite uncomfortable. The two of them became silent for another while, but Northern's gaze was on her throughout. He was thinking deeply. He finally sat up and crossed his leg. Then he asked her, so let's say what you know about me is something that you are sure about, and Raven asks you'll tell her, right? I most certainly will. I owe her everything, including my life. Sadly, my life is not mine to give. So this is the best I can do. Are you telling me to be cautious around you? Are you not already cautious around all of us? Northern? Northern chuckled slightly. For some reason, she seems edgy today. Is she still angry from what that darn sage did to her? Terence moved her head down slightly and said, Northern, please, can I ask for a favor? Northern nodded. Sure. Can you blindfold me? Huh? Why? The request took Northern by surprise. Just because I don't want to see anything in this place. Northern arched a brow. I don't understand. It's just me trying to shield my faith. Northern looked around the walls and returned his eyes to Terence, finally understanding. Oh, so you are protecting yourself from this much information, as they may provide a fact about all that could lead you to doubt. Terence was silent for a few breaths. Then she uttered again. Please blindfold me. Sure. He stood up and moved closer to her. Simultaneously, she extended a black cloth to him. Northern took it and folded it around her eyes, then tied it tautly behind her head. Just then, Helena and Raven came downstairs. They paused in their steps as they saw the two of them. Geez, you couldn't have chosen a much safer place, Helena commented with downturned lips. Northern was at first urged to let her know it's not what she thought. But sometimes, as humans, we need to resist the urge to explain. He ignored her and walked away from Terence. Before he could sit down back, however, Raven's voice touched the air. Northern, please come with us. We found something. Northern looked up at her and straightened his back. What is that? A secret door. Northern's eyes immediately widened. Of course there was a secret door. Northern's thought was not because this was a tower, and towers like this were always designed to have secret doors, but rather because Fagner, the writer of these scripts, spoke of something about a hidden tome. In his description, he talked about all 10 rooms and the purpose they were supposed to serve. The reason why this tower was built. Whose prison it was supposed to be. Which was none other than the Chaos Prince himself. Of course, while reading it, Northern had figured out the reason why the tower was calling him. It was simply resonating with the vestige of chaos and void that was in him. If he was to be exact, he would say of chaos, because Northern still felt a balance, which meant he could refuse the pull if he wanted to. And he felt that balance was brought about by the tranquility that his void offered. Perhaps this was what the Chaos Prince himself was trying to achieve. He was trying to balance chaos so much, which was why he went ahead to split the sun. Because in the core of the sun was an unborn void that only the Chaos Prince knew about. Of course, all of these were just extra things that Fagner talked about, because they were linked to the reason why a prison that was built by the Tyrant of Chaos to contain his rebellious son became a home instead. And Fagner, who was the warden, became its butler. If you want access to fast updates or the full novel in high-quality audio, contact me now and buy. I offer over 300 complete audiobooks from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, and more. No locked episodes, no subscriptions, just one-time payment via PayPal or Ko-fi. Message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out the full list of available novels on Discord. Start listening to your next favorite audiobook today.